They built a dream mansion. It became a nightmare. October 2007. A real estate agent stands in the driveway of what should be the most beautiful house in Florida. Behind her rises a 90,000 square foot palace, marble columns, gold-trimmed windows, a fountain that cost more than most people's homes. But she is not smiling. She is calculating how to sell a house that nobody wants. A house that destroyed the family who built it. A house that sits empty because the dream became a curse. This is the dark story of Versailles, the largest private residence ever attempted in America. For years, it was supposed to be proof that anything is possible if you dream big enough and work hard enough. A monument to the American dream built by a man who started with nothing and became a billionaire. But tonight, the construction has stopped. The money has run out, and the family who poured everything into this mansion is fighting just to survive. Behind every gold-plated bathroom fixture and hand-carved Italian marble staircase, there was a cost nobody talked about. Behind every massive ballroom and private movie theater, there were decisions that slowly poisoned a marriage, damaged children, and turned a symbol of success into a monument of excess that nearly destroyed everything. Why did a self-made billionaire and his former beauty queen wife pour $100 million into a house they would never finish? How did a dream home turn into a financial nightmare that almost cost them their business, their fortune, and their family? And what happens when you build your identity around a building, then watch that building become impossible to complete? This is not just a story about a big house. It is a story about American ambition taken to its breaking point, about the difference between success and excess, about what happens when the thing you are building starts to consume you from the inside, about a dream that became a prison before the walls were even finished. So what really happens when your dream house becomes the thing that destroys your dream life? If you enjoy deep investigations into extraordinary homes and the families behind them, please like this video and subscribe. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Tell me in the comments which mansion story I should explore next. The mansion still stands on the shore of Lake Butler, just outside Orlando, Florida. 45 minutes from Disney World, 15 minutes from the office towers where David Siegel built his fortune. From certain angles, especially at sunset, it looks almost finished. The roofline is complete. The windows are in. The structure rises against the Florida sky like something transplanted from the French countryside, ambitious and impossible to ignore. But step closer and the truth becomes visible. Construction equipment sits silent and rusting. Tarps cover unfinished sections. Weeds push through cracks in the circular driveway. Whole wings remain unfinished shells, open to weather and time. This is not a home. It is a monument to what happens when dreams grow too large and reality arrives too late. By 2008, David and Jackie Siegel had been building Versailles for nearly 4 years. They had already spent over $75 million, and the house was maybe 60% complete. They needed another $25 million minimum, possibly $50 million to finish what they had started. But the money was gone. Not just the construction money, all of it. The global financial crisis had arrived like a wrecking ball, and the Siegel empire, built on timeshare resorts and real estate financing, was collapsing in real time. David Siegel was 73 years old, a self-made billionaire who had survived recessions before. He had built Westgate Resorts from nothing into the largest privately owned timeshare company in America. He employed thousands of people. He owned properties across the country. He had met presidents and hosted charity galas. He believed deeply and without question that he could will his way through any problem by working harder and thinking bigger. But this time was different. His business model depended on cheap credit and consumer confidence. When the housing market crashed and banks stopped lending, his entire operation seized up. Customers stopped buying timeshares. Banks demanded loan payments he could not make. Investors who had trusted him for decades started asking very uncomfortable questions. Construction at Versailles stopped completely. Workers were sent home. Architects and designers were dismissed. The house that was supposed to be their crowning achievement, the physical proof that David and Jackie Siegel had made it beyond anything they could have imagined as children, froze mid-construction. Unfinished, exposed, vulnerable. Jackie Siegel, former Miss Florida and 28 years younger than her husband, watched the dream she had helped design slip away. She had wanted this house. She had planned every detail, every room, every imported fixture. It was supposed to be their forever home, a place where their 8 children would grow up surrounded by beauty and possibility. a place that proved to the world and maybe to herself that the girl from Binghamton, New York could become American royalty. Now she walked through half-finished hallways, past rooms without floors, beneath ceilings missing their chandeliers, and tried to understand how they had gotten here. How a dream this big could turn into a nightmare this dark. The parties were over. The optimism was gone. The vision that had seemed so clear just a few years earlier now felt like a cruel joke. David spent his days trying to save the business, scrambling to refinance loans and sell properties, fighting to keep Westgate alive while the entire economy burned around him. Jackie spent her days managing a shrinking staff, cutting expenses, and trying to shield their children from the growing realization that everything might collapse. The house stood on its lakefront property, visible from the road, a constant reminder of ambition that had outrun judgment. Some neighbors called it an eyesore. Others felt sympathy. Most simply could not understand why anyone would try to build something so massive, so expensive, so unnecessary in the first place. What those neighbors did not know, what almost no one outside the family understood, was how much this house meant to the people building it. It was not just about size or luxury. It was about proof that David Siegel, the son of a grocer from Miami, could build something grander than old money families with inherited wealth. Proof that Jackie Siegel, who had once worked as a computer engineer to pay her bills, could design a lifestyle most people only saw in magazines. Proof that their marriage, their family, their entire story mattered. The house was supposed to be their legacy. Instead, it became their burden. A beautiful, unfinished burden that would haunt them for years and force both of them to confront uncomfortable truths about who they were, what they valued, and whether any of it had been worth the cost. This is the story of how they got there. The story of how two people with everything somehow ended up with a mansion they could not afford, a business on the brink of collapse, and a marriage strained to the breaking point. It is the story of the dream before the nightmare, the decisions that seemed smart until they were not, and the price of building your entire identity around a house. We start where all stories like this begin, with the people who built the dream and the hunger that drove them to build it in the first place. David Siegel was born in 1935 in Chicago, but grew up in Miami, the son of a Jewish grocer who worked long hours for modest pay. His father ran a small market, the kind of place where customers bought on credit and paid when they could. The family was not poor, but they were never comfortable. Money was always tight. Luxuries were rare. David learned early that if he wanted more than what his father's grocery store could provide, he would have to find it himself. He was smart. Not the best student, but sharp in ways that mattered outside classrooms. He understood people. He understood what they wanted, and more importantly, how to convince them they needed what he was selling. Those skills would carry him farther than any degree. After high school, Siegel tried college but did not finish. He was restless, impatient, hungry for something traditional education could not provide. He wanted to build things. He wanted to make deals. He wanted to prove that a grocer's son from Miami could become someone people noticed. He started selling real estate in the 1960s, working in South Florida at a time when the state was booming. Retirees poured in from the north. Developers turned swampland into subdivisions. Money moved fast, and Siegel learned to move with it. He was good at reading buyers, understanding what fantasy they were purchasing when they bought a Florida property. Sunshine, freedom, a new start. But selling traditional real estate felt limiting. Siegel wanted something bigger, something he could control completely. In 1980, he found it: timeshares. The timeshare model was simple and brilliant. Instead of selling a vacation property to one buyer for full price, you divided ownership into weekly increments and sold the same property to 52 different buyers. Each buyer got 1 week per year. The property generated far more revenue than a traditional sale. And buyers who could never afford a vacation home outright could now own a piece of the dream for a fraction of the cost. It was genius. It was also often predatory. The timeshare industry quickly earned a reputation for high-pressure sales tactics, misleading promises, and contracts that trapped buyers into long-term financial commitments they did not fully understand. Siegel was not the worst operator in the business, but he was aggressive. His sales teams were trained to close deals fast, using urgency and emotion to overcome hesitation. And it worked. By the 1990s, Siegel's company, Westgate Resorts, was one of the largest timeshare operations in America. He owned properties in Florida, Tennessee, Nevada, and beyond. He employed thousands. His personal fortune grew into the hundreds of millions. Siegel loved the game. The deals, the negotiations, the moment when a reluctant buyer finally signed the contract. He worked constantly 7 days a week, obsessed with expansion. His first marriage fell apart under the weight of his ambition. His children from that marriage barely saw him. Work was everything, success was everything. Building the empire was the only thing that mattered. By the early 2000s, David Siegel was a billionaire. He had made it. He had proven that the grocer's son could build an empire, but he still felt like he needed more properties, more revenue. More proof that he was not just successful, but exceptional. And then he met Jackie. Jackie Mallory grew up in Binghamton, New York, the daughter of middle-class parents who valued education and hard work. She was beautiful, effortlessly so, the kind of girl who turned heads without trying. But she was also smart. She studied computer engineering at Rochester Institute of Technology, graduating in a field dominated by men, determined to build a career on her own terms. After college, she moved to Florida and worked at IBM as a computer engineer. The job was stable, respectable, well-paying by 1990s standards. But Jackie wanted more than stability. She wanted excitement. She wanted to be seen. So she entered beauty pageants. She won a lot. Local titles, regional titles, and eventually in 1993 she was crowned Mrs. Florida. The title opened doors. It brought attention, opportunities, and invitations to events where successful, powerful men gathered. At one of those events, she met David Siegel. He was 30 years older, recently divorced, wealthy beyond anything she had encountered. He was not conventionally handsome, but he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had built something real. He was charming in his own blunt, transactional way. He told her he was going to marry her on their first date. Jackie was intrigued. David represented everything she had dreamed about as a girl, watching dynasty and lifestyles of the rich and famous. Private jets, luxury cars, a life without financial limits. He was not a prince, but he was a self-made king, and that was even better. They married in 2000. Jackie was 23 years younger than David's oldest son. Some people whispered that she was a gold digger. Others assumed the marriage would not last. Jackie did not care. She had found her opportunity, and she intended to make the most of it. David bought her a 26,000-square-foot mansion in the exclusive Windermere area near Orlando. It was enormous by normal standards, with a pool, a home theater, staff quarters, and more space than Jackie had ever imagined living in. She loved it, but almost immediately she started to feel confined. The house was big, but it was not special. Other billionaires in Florida had similar homes. Jackie wanted something that would make people stop and stare, something that would define her not just as Mrs. David Siegel, but as someone with her own vision, her own legacy. She started collecting design magazines. She toured European palaces during vacations. She began sketching ideas for a house that would be more than just large. It would be legendary, the kind of place people would talk about for generations. David indulged her. Why not? He had the money. He loved the idea of building something bigger than anyone else. A house that would make a statement, not just to Florida society, but to the entire country. A monument to what David Siegel had achieved. Together, they began planning Versailles. In 2004, David and Jackie Siegel purchased 10 acres of prime lakefront property just outside Orlando. The location was perfect, close to David's business headquarters, but secluded enough to feel private. The lake offered stunning water views. The land was large enough to build anything they could imagine. And what they imagined was extraordinary. They hired architects and told them to think bigger, much bigger. They wanted the largest single-family home in the United States. 90,000 square feet, that was the target. 90,000 square feet of living space designed to look like a French chateau but filled with every luxury American money could buy. The plans were staggering. 13 bedrooms, 23 bathrooms. 3 indoor pools, including one Olympic-sized. 2 outdoor pools. A bowling alley, a roller skating rink, a 2-story movie theater with a balcony, a ballroom that could host 500 guests, a wine cellar for thousands of bottles, a garage for 20 cars, staff quarters for a live-in team of housekeepers, chefs, and maintenance workers. There would be marble imported from Italy, gold leaf detailing throughout, custom chandeliers from Europe, and hand-carved wood panels in nearly every room. The grand staircase was designed to rival anything found in European palaces, sweeping and dramatic, the kind of entrance that demanded attention. Jackie worked with designers to plan every detail. She wanted a spa with a sauna, massage rooms, and beauty salon. She wanted a children's wing with separate bedrooms for each of their 8 children, plus playrooms, study areas, and private bathrooms. She wanted a master suite larger than most people's entire homes, with his and hers bathrooms, separate closets the size of boutiques, and a private balcony overlooking the lake. David wanted toys. He wanted the biggest home theater screen available, the latest technology, and a man cave where he could retreat and watch sports. He wanted a kitchen capable of catering large parties without bringing in outside help. He wanted spaces designed to impress business associates and potential investors. Neither of them stopped to ask the most important question. Do we actually need this? The answer was no. They had a perfectly functional 26,000 square foot home already. Their children were happy. Their life was comfortable, but need was never the point. The point was scale. The point was making a statement. The point was building something so large, so excessive, so impossible to ignore that everyone who saw it would understand. David and Jackie Siegel had won. Construction began in 2004. The estimated cost at the time was somewhere between $50 million and $75 million. David was confident he could afford it. His business was booming. Westgate was generating hundreds of millions in annual revenue. Credit was cheap. Banks were happy to lend. The housing market was surging. Everything seemed perfect. The first year went smoothly. Foundations were poured. Framing went up. The structure began to take shape. Neighbors watched in disbelief as the mansion rose higher and wider than anything they had seen in a residential neighborhood. It looked less like a house and more like a resort, or a museum, or a monument. Jackie visited the construction site almost daily. She walked through unfinished rooms, imagining how they would look once complete. She made changes constantly, upgrading materials, adding features, expanding spaces. The architects tried to keep up. The contractors adjusted schedules. The budget began to creep upward. David was too busy running his business to pay close attention. He trusted Jackie to handle the house. He signed the checks without asking too many questions. After all, what was another million or two when you were worth $1 billion? By 2006, the project was well underway. The exterior walls were up. The roof was taking shape. Interior work was beginning. Workers filled the site dozens at a time, doing everything from framing walls to installing imported marble. The timeline kept stretching. The costs kept rising, but nobody worried. The money seemed endless, and then the housing market started to crack. At first, it was subtle. Sales slowed. Loan applications took longer to approve. A few buyers backed out of timeshare contracts. David noticed, but he was not concerned. He had been through downturns before. This would pass. It did not pass. By 2007, the cracks became chasms. Banks stopped lending. Buyers disappeared. Foreclosures surged. The entire American real estate market, which had seemed invincible just months earlier, collapsed with stunning speed. David's business model depended on credit. Timeshare buyers rarely paid cash. They financed their purchases through loans, which Westgate either provided directly or arranged through partner banks. When credit froze, sales vanished. Revenue dropped. Cash flow tightened. David tried to adjust. He cut costs, laid off staff, and paused expansion plans. But the damage was spreading faster than he could contain. He had personally guaranteed hundreds of millions in loans. If Westgate defaulted, he would lose everything, not just the business, everything, his properties, his assets, his fortune, and the unfinished mansion on Lake Butler. Construction at Versailles slowed, then stopped. By late 2008, the site was quiet. The dream house that was supposed to be their greatest achievement had become a symbol of everything going wrong. David and Jackie stood at the edge of financial ruin. And the mansion, their beautiful, unfinished mansion, sat on the shore like a monument to excess, ambition, and the terrible cost of building a dream too big to sustain. To understand how David and Jackie Siegel lost everything, you need to understand how David Siegel made everything in the first place. And that story begins with timeshares. The business model that built an empire and the industry that almost destroyed it. A timeshare is a simple idea with a complicated execution. Instead of buying a vacation property outright, buyers purchase the right to use that property for a specific week each year. 52 weeks, 52 potential buyers. The developer sells the same condo or villa dozens of times, generating revenue far exceeding a traditional sale. For buyers, the pitch is compelling. You cannot afford a $500,000 vacation home, but you can afford $20,000 for one guaranteed week per year in a beautiful resort. You get access to luxury without the full cost. You can vacation in the same place annually, building memories and routines. And many timeshare systems offer exchange programs, letting you trade your week in Orlando for a week in Hawaii or Mexico. It sounds reasonable. For some buyers, it works exactly as promised. But for many others, timeshares become financial traps. The industry is built on aggressive sales tactics. Potential buyers are lured with offers of free hotel stays, discounted vacations, or gift cards. The catch: you must attend a 90-minute sales presentation. Those 90 minutes often stretch to 3 or 4 hours, filled with high-pressure tactics designed to close the deal before you leave the room. Salespeople are trained to manipulate emotions. They create urgency. This price is only available today. They appeal to family values. Don't you want your kids to have memories of family vacations? They shame hesitation. What kind of person does not invest in their family's happiness? Buyers are exhausted, overwhelmed, and emotionally manipulated into signing contracts they have not fully read. Financing is arranged on the spot, often at high interest rates. The true long-term cost, including annual maintenance fees that rise steadily over time, is downplayed or hidden. Once the contract is signed, buyers discover the reality. Maintenance fees increase every year. Booking the week you want is difficult because availability is limited. Reselling is nearly impossible because the market is flooded with people trying to escape their contracts. Many buyers end up paying thousands of dollars annually for a vacation they no longer want and cannot use. The timeshare industry has been investigated repeatedly by consumer protection agencies and criticized by financial experts. Yet it continues to thrive because it is legal and because companies like Westgate are very, very good at selling. David Siegel built Westgate into a giant through relentless expansion and masterful sales execution. He hired talented salespeople, paid them generous commissions, and created a culture where closing deals was the only thing that mattered. His resorts were nice, often genuinely high-quality properties with good amenities. But the real product Westgate sold was not vacations. It was hope. The promise of a better life, family togetherness, and access to luxury. By the mid-2000s, Westgate owned resorts in Orlando, Las Vegas, Gatlinburg, Tennessee, Park City, Utah, and beyond. The company employed over 10,000 people. Annual revenue exceeded $1 billion. David Siegel was worth an estimated $1.2 billion personally. But the business model had a hidden vulnerability. It depended entirely on consumer confidence and access to credit. Buyers needed to feel optimistic about the future and able to borrow money easily. When the 2008 financial crisis destroyed both, Westgate's revenue collapsed almost overnight. Sales dropped by more than 80%. Buyers who had signed contracts before the crash defaulted on payments. Banks that had financed those purchases demanded Westgate buy back the loans or face lawsuits. Properties that had been cash-generating assets became financial liabilities draining money every month. David had personally guaranteed loans totaling hundreds of millions of dollars. He had used his personal assets, including his homes and properties, as collateral. If Westgate defaulted, he did not just lose the business. He lost everything. He fought desperately to keep the company alive. He sold off properties at steep losses. He renegotiated loans. He laid off thousands of workers. He mortgaged everything he owned, including the unfinished Versailles, trying to generate enough cash to keep Westgate operational. The stress was crushing. David was in his 70s, working 16-hour days, fighting battles on a dozen fronts simultaneously. Lawyers, bankers, creditors, employees, all demanding answers and solutions he did not have. Jackie watched her husband age in real time. The confident, charming billionaire she had married was disappearing, replaced by an exhausted, angry man consumed by a crisis he could not fix. Their marriage, already strained by the pressures of building Versailles, began to fracture under the weight of financial catastrophe. The mansion sat unfinished, a constant reminder of everything they had wanted and everything they stood to lose. The dream that was supposed to unite them was tearing them apart, and the worst was yet to come. While David battled to save the business, Jackie tried to maintain the illusion that everything was fine. It was not fine. Nothing was fine. But she had built her identity around being Mrs. David Siegel, the billionaire's wife, and she could not let that image collapse even as the foundation beneath it crumbled. They still lived in their original 26,000-square-foot mansion in Windermere. It was absurdly large for a family, but it was theirs, at least for now. Jackie filled it with staff, nannies, housekeepers, chefs, and personal assistants. She had 8 children ranging from toddlers to teenagers, and managing them required a small army. But Jackie did not manage them the way most mothers did. She delegated. The nannies handled bedtime. The housekeepers cleaned up messes. Jackie floated through the house in designer clothes, checking on things but rarely doing things. She had worked hard to escape the life of an ordinary middle-class woman, and she was not about to go back. Her daily routine was surreal. She shopped constantly, buying clothing, jewelry, and decorations she did not need. She treated her spending like a job, something to fill the hours. When David suggested cutting back, she resisted. Shopping was her therapy, her escape, her way of feeling in control when everything else felt chaotic. The staff watched her with a mix of pity and frustration. They saw a woman who had everything material but seemed lost. Jackie was kind to them, never cruel, but she lived in a bubble so removed from reality that she sometimes seemed like a character playing a role rather than a person living a life. Her relationship with David deteriorated. He was never home. When he was stressed, distracted, and short-tempered. They barely spoke beyond logistics. Who was picking up the kids? What bills needed paying? The romance, whatever had existed in the early years, was gone. Jackie began spending more time at the unfinished Versailles. She walked through empty rooms, imagining how they would look once complete. She measured spaces. She planned furniture arrangements. She convinced herself that once the house was finished, everything would be better. The house would fix the marriage. The house would make them happy. The house would prove that their life together meant something. It was a fantasy, of course. Houses do not fix broken marriages. But Jackie needed to believe in something, and the mansion was all she had left. Meanwhile, the children were growing up in chaos. The older kids understood something was wrong. They saw their father's stress, their mother's denial, and the staff whispering about money problems. The younger ones were shielded but confused. Why had construction stopped at the new house? Why did Daddy seem angry all the time? Why did Mommy keep buying things? One of the children later described their childhood as living in a beautiful prison. They had every material advantage, but they lacked the one thing money cannot buy. Present, engaged parents who prioritized their emotional needs over image and ambition. Jackie loved her children, but she did not know how to connect with them beyond providing material comfort. She had grown up dreaming of a life like this, and now that she had it, she could not admit it was hollow. The family's lifestyle became a performance. They still attended charity events, still smiled for photos, still projected success. But behind the scenes, the bills were piling up. Staff paychecks were delayed. Credit cards were maxed out. The illusion was maintained, but barely. In 2012, a documentary filmmaker named Lauren Greenfield approached the Segels with a proposal. She wanted to make a film about the construction of Versailles, a behind-the-scenes look at the building of America's largest home. David and Jackie agreed, assuming the film would be a vanity project celebrating their success. They were wrong. Greenfield's film, titled The Queen of Versailles, became something much darker. It captured the financial collapse in real time, showing David's desperation, Jackie's denial, and the surreal disconnect between their collapsing empire and their stubborn refusal to change their lifestyle. The film premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in 2012 and became a sensation. Critics praised it as a damning portrait of American excess and the hollowness of wealth pursued for its own sake. Audiences watched in fascination and horror as the Segels struggled to maintain a lifestyle they could no longer afford while their dream house sat unfinished in the background. David hated the film. He felt betrayed, humiliated, and misrepresented. He sued the filmmakers for defamation, though the lawsuit was eventually dismissed. Jackie had mixed feelings. She understood the film made her look foolish, but part of her appreciated the attention. She had wanted to be famous, and now she was, even if not in the way she had imagined. The documentary did something neither David nor Jackie expected. It forced them to confront the truth they had been avoiding. Their marriage was broken. Their lifestyle was unsustainable. And the mansion, their beautiful dream mansion, had become a symbol not of success, but of everything wrong with their lives. While David and Jackie fought their battles, 8 children were growing up in the crossfire. Each of them experienced the family's rise and fall differently, but all of them carried scars from living in a world where image mattered more than connection. The oldest children from David's previous marriage watched the Versailles drama from a distance. They had their own complicated relationships with their father, a man who had been largely absent during their childhoods, too busy building his empire to build relationships. They understood better than anyone that David Siegel was a brilliant businessman and a poor father. The children from David and Jackie's marriage lived inside the chaos. There was Victoria, the eldest daughter from this union, smart and perceptive, who understood far earlier than her parents realized that something was deeply wrong. There were the younger kids, some still in elementary school when the crisis hit, confused by the tension but not yet old enough to understand it. And then there was David Jr., the youngest son who became a casualty of the family's obsession with Versailles in the most tragic way possible. David Jr. was a bright, troubled kid. He struggled with the pressure of being a Siegel, of growing up in wealth so extreme it made normal childhood impossible. He had everything materially, but he felt invisible emotionally. His parents were consumed by the house and the business. The staff raised him more than his mother or father did. As a teenager, he began experimenting with drugs. At first, it was recreational, the kind of experimentation many kids try. But for David Jr., it became an escape. Drugs numbed the loneliness, the pressure, the sense that he did not belong in his own family. His parents noticed but did not intervene effectively. Jackie assumed it was a phase. David was too distracted by the financial crisis to focus on his son's pain. They sent him to therapy, but therapy requires follow-through, consistency, and emotional presence. The Siegels provided none of that. In 2015, David Jr. died of a drug overdose. He was 18 years old. The family was shattered. Jackie, who had spent years floating through life in a bubble of denial, was forced to confront the cost of her choices. She had spent so much time planning Versailles, shopping, and maintaining an image that she had missed the signs her son was dying inside. David, who had spent his entire life building businesses and proving his worth through success, faced the brutal truth that none of his wealth could bring his son back. All the money in the world had not saved David Jr. In fact, the wealth and the dysfunction it enabled had probably contributed to his death. The other children watched their parents grieve and wondered if things would finally change. Would their parents wake up? Would they stop obsessing over the mansion and start focusing on the family? For a while, it seemed possible. David and Jackie both spoke publicly about the tragedy. Jackie became an advocate for drug awareness. David donated to addiction treatment programs. They seemed to soften, to recognize that what they had been chasing was not worth the cost. But grief is complicated, and people, especially people with lifelong patterns of avoidance and control, do not change easily. Within a year, David was back to working 16-hour days. Jackie was back to shopping and planning for the eventual completion of Versailles. They had processed their son's death the only way they knew how, by burying it beneath activity, ambition, and the comforting illusion that if they could just finish the house, everything would be okay. The surviving children learned a hard lesson. In their family, the mansion mattered more than they did. The dream, the image, the monument to success. Those were the priorities. Love was conditional and connection was optional. What mattered was maintaining the story David and Jackie had built about themselves. Some of the children rebelled. Some withdrew. Some left as soon as they were old enough, desperate to escape the shadow of Versailles and build lives that felt real. Others stayed, trapped by financial dependence or misplaced loyalty. All of them carried the weight of growing up in a family that valued success over presence, image over intimacy, and ambition over emotional health. And the mansion, still unfinished, still waiting, stood on the lakefront like a monument to all the things their parents had sacrificed in pursuit of a dream that was never really about family in the first place. While the family drama unfolded, David Siegel was fighting the battle of his life to save Westgate Resorts. The company he had spent 40 years building was on the verge of total collapse, and with it, every dollar he had ever made. The problems went deeper than just the financial crisis. Westgate's business model had always been aggressive, bordering on predatory. High-pressure sales tactics worked during boom times when consumers felt confident and credit was easy. But when the economy crashed, those tactics stopped working. Worse, they made Westgate a target. Consumer complaints piled up. Buyers who regretted their timeshare purchases began posting warnings online. Review sites filled with stories of manipulative sales presentations, hidden fees, and contracts that were nearly impossible to escape. Westgate's reputation, never great to begin with, became toxic. David tried to adapt. He launched marketing campaigns emphasizing quality and value. He offered incentives to existing owners. He cut prices and introduced financing deals. Nothing worked. People were not buying timeshares. They were trying to get rid of the ones they already owned. Banks that had financed Westgate's expansion began demanding repayment. David had borrowed hundreds of millions of dollars using his properties as collateral. When revenues collapsed, he could not make the loan payments. Foreclosures loomed. Legal battles erupted on multiple fronts. One of the biggest fights involved a massive casino and resort project in Las Vegas. Westgate was building what was supposed to be the tallest residential building in the city, a 52-story tower with condos, timeshares, and luxury amenities. It was called PH Towers Westgate. David had poured millions into the project, borrowing heavily to finance construction. Then the crash hit. Sales stopped. Financing disappeared. David could not afford to finish the building. The bank that had loaned him the money, a division of Lehman Brothers, also collapsed in the financial crisis. The situation became a legal nightmare, with multiple parties fighting over who owed what to whom. Eventually, David lost the Las Vegas property. It was sold for a fraction of what he had invested. The loss was staggering, not just financially, but emotionally. David had built his identity on never losing, on always finding a way to win. Losing the Vegas project felt like personal failure. At the same time, he was fighting to keep the Orlando headquarters of Westgate. The company's flagship property, a massive resort and convention center, was underwater financially. The mortgage was crushing. Revenues were a fraction of what they needed to be. Creditors circled like sharks. David worked around the clock, negotiating with banks, restructuring loans, selling assets at fire sale prices. He liquidated properties in Tennessee and Utah. He sold off smaller resorts to raise cash. He cut staff to the bone, laying off thousands of loyal employees, many of whom had worked for him for decades. The stress aged him visibly. Friends who saw him during this period described a man hollowed out by pressure, exhausted, angry, and bitterly aware that everything he had built might disappear. And through it all, Versailles sat unfinished. A $75 million albatross around his neck. The banks wanted him to sell it. Potential buyers came to look, but no one was willing to pay what the property was worth, assuming it was worth anything at all. Who wanted a 90,000 square foot mansion in a collapsed real estate market? David refused to sell at a loss. He had poured too much into the house to walk away now. It was not rational. It was pride. The same pride that had driven him to build the house in the first place. Jackie begged him to let it go. "We don't need it," she said, though she did not fully believe her own words. David ignored her. The house was a symbol. If he lost the house, it meant he had truly failed, and David's sigil did not fail. But by 2010, it was clear that Westgate's survival was far from certain. Revenue was stabilizing slightly, but debt remained crushing. David was refinancing loans at brutal interest rates just to stay afloat. The company survived, but barely, and the cost was everything. Relationships, health, family, all sacrificed to keep the empire from total collapse. Westgate's near-death experience changed the company. It became smaller, leaner, more cautious. David, once fearless about expansion, became obsessed with cash flow and debt reduction. The hustler who had bet everything on timeshares learned the hard way that bet the company moves can destroy you as easily as they can make you. The business survived, but the cost was steep. And the mansion, the dream that was supposed to celebrate success, remained frozen in time, a monument to ambition that had overreached and a warning about the price of excess. While the Sigils struggled inside their crumbling empire, the world outside watched with a mixture of fascination, judgment, and pity. Neighbors, staff, and the general public all had front-row seats to the slow-motion disaster unfolding on Lake Butler. The neighbors in Windermere and the surrounding areas had mixed feelings about Versailles from the beginning. Some admired the ambition. Florida was full of wealthy people building big houses, and the Sigils were just taking it to the next level. Others were horrified. A 90,000 square foot mansion was not a home. It was a statement, an ego trip, a monument to excess that made everyone else's houses look small. When construction stopped and the property sat half-finished, the neighbors' opinions shifted to frustration and embarrassment. The unfinished mansion was an eyesore. It brought down property values. It attracted attention, gawkers driving by slowly taking pictures, treating the neighborhood like a tourist attraction. Some neighbors felt sympathy. They understood the financial crisis had hit everyone, and the Sigils had just been caught at the worst possible moment. But others felt the Sigils deserved what they got. They had been reckless, greedy, and foolish. Building a house that big, spending that much money, borrowing that heavily, it was asking for disaster. The staff who worked for the Sigils had their own complicated perspective. Many of them had been with the family for years, some over a decade. They had watched the children grow up. They had cleaned the house, cooked the meals, and managed the daily chaos that came with serving a billionaire family. When the money ran out, their paychecks started arriving late. Some staff were let go completely. Others had their hours cut. Jackie apologized but seemed genuinely confused about why she could not just write a check to fix the problem. She did not understand or refused to accept that there was no money left. The staff who stayed did so out of loyalty, habit, or lack of better options. They saw things the public never knew about, the fights between David and Jackie, the children acting out, desperate for attention, the surreal disconnect between the family's public image and private reality. One former housekeeper later described working for the Sigils as like working in a beautiful museum where no one was actually happy. The house was stunning. The possessions were extraordinary. But the people living there seemed trapped by their own success, unable to step back and ask if any of it was actually making them happy. The public fascination with Versailles exploded after the Queen of Versailles documentary was released. Suddenly, the Sigils were famous, but not in the way they had hoped. They became symbols of American excess, cautionary tales about the dangers of debt and ego. Online commentators were brutal. Message boards and social media filled with criticism. People mocked Jackie for her shopping addiction and out-of-touch behavior. They called David greedy and arrogant. They speculated about when the mansion would be foreclosed and torn down. Some people defended the Sigils, arguing that they were victims of bad timing and an economic collapse beyond their control. David had built a real business, employed thousands, and created genuine value. He was not a con artist or a criminal. He was just a man who had taken on too much risk and lost the bet. But most people saw the Sigils as examples of everything wrong with America: the worship of wealth, the obsession with size and status, the belief that more is always better, the willingness to sacrifice family, health, and happiness in pursuit of material success. The documentary became required viewing in business schools and sociology classes. Professors used it to teach lessons about risk management, consumer debt, and the psychological cost of extreme wealth. The Sigils, whether they liked it or not, had become case studies. Tour buses started driving past the unfinished mansion. Guides pointed it out as a landmark of failure, a symbol of the 2008 financial crash. Photographers captured images of the empty shell, posting them online with captions like, "When your dream becomes a nightmare," and "The price of ambition." David and Jackie hated being spectacles, but they also could not look away from the attention. Jackie gave interviews, appeared on talk shows, and tried to control the narrative. She insisted they were still wealthy, still happy, still planning to finish the house someday. David was more honest in private moments. He admitted to close friends that building Versailles had been a mistake, not because they could not afford it, but because it had consumed them. The house became the center of their lives, and in doing so, it had poisoned everything else. But admitting that publicly would mean admitting failure. And David Sigil had spent his entire life refusing to fail. So the mansion sat, watched by neighbors, former staff, and a fascinated public, a monument to dreams that grew too large and ambitions that consumed the dreamers. The most obvious cost of Versailles was financial. $75 million spent, with another 25 to 50 million needed to finish. Money that could have been invested, saved, or used to secure the family's future instead poured into a house they never lived in. But the financial cost was just the beginning. The real price of Versailles was paid in relationships, health, and time that could never be recovered. David's health deteriorated visibly. The stress of the financial crisis and the pressure of keeping Westgate alive took years off his life. He developed heart problems. He aged rapidly. Friends who had known him in his 60s, energetic and confident, saw him in his 70s and barely recognized him. He worked every day, including weekends and holidays, driven by fear that if he stopped, everything would collapse. He had no hobbies, no friendships outside of business, no identity beyond being David Sigil, the timeshare king. When that identity was threatened, he had nothing else to fall back on. Jackie's mental health suffered. She had built her life around being a billionaire's wife, and when that role was threatened, she did not know who she was anymore. She shopped compulsively, filling the emptiness with things that provided temporary comfort but no lasting satisfaction. She struggled with depression, though she rarely admitted it publicly. She gained weight despite having access to personal trainers and nutritionists. She withdrew from friends. Her life became smaller, centered around the house, the children, and the fantasy that finishing Versailles would somehow fix everything. The marriage, never particularly strong, became transactional. David provided money when he had it. Jackie managed the household and appeared at his side for public events. But they stopped being partners. They barely talked beyond logistics. Romance was a distant memory. Both of them later admitted in separate interviews that they stayed together mostly because separating would be too complicated and too expensive. It was easier to coexist than to untangle the financial and legal mess divorce would create. The children paid the highest price. They grew up in a home where material possessions were abundant but emotional connection was scarce. Their parents were physically present but emotionally absent, too consumed by Versailles and the business to truly see their children's needs. David Jr.'s death was the most visible cost, but the other children suffered in quieter ways. Some struggled academically. Others developed anxiety and depression. Some became entitled, adopting their parents' worst traits, believing that money and status were the only things that mattered. The older children who escaped the family orbit spoke later about the difficulty of building normal lives. How do you relate to people when you grew up in a 26,000-square-foot mansion with live-in staff? How do you develop a work ethic when you never had to work for anything? How do you trust relationships when the only model you had was transactional? The staff who worked for the Sigils also paid a price. Many of them gave years of their lives to the family, working long hours for wages that were decent but not exceptional. When the money ran out, they were let go without much warning or compensation. The loyalty they had shown was not returned. Some of them had built their own lives around the Sigils' wealth. They had taken out mortgages, bought cars, and made plans assuming their jobs were secure. When those jobs disappeared, they struggled. A few lost their homes. Others had to uproot their families and move to find work. The environmental cost of Versailles was rarely discussed but significant. The mansion required enormous amounts of energy to heat, cool, and maintain. The construction used rare materials imported from around the world, contributing to environmental degradation in those regions. The landscaping required constant irrigation in a state already struggling with water resources. The social cost was subtler but real. Versailles became a symbol of inequality, a physical manifestation of the growing gap between the ultra-wealthy and everyone else. It fed resentment and anger. It became a talking point in discussions about wealth distribution, taxation, and fairness. When people looked at Versailles, they did not just see a big house. They saw a system that allowed one family to spend $100 million on a single home, while millions of Americans struggled to afford basic health care, education, and housing. The Sigils never intended to become symbols of inequality. They saw themselves as self-made success stories, proof that the American dream was alive. But intent does not matter when the outcome is so visible and so extreme. The hidden costs of Versailles, the health, relationships, time, and social impact far exceeded the financial costs, and unlike money, those costs could never be recovered. By 2013, the worst of the financial crisis had passed. The economy was recovering slowly. Westgate stabilized. David managed to restructure his debts and avoid total collapse. The company was smaller, leaner, and less dominant than before, but it survived. And with survival came a question. What do we do about Versailles? The mansion sat on its lakefront property, 60% complete, exposed to weather and slowly deteriorating. David and Jackie faced a choice. Sell it at a massive loss and move on. Abandon it completely and let the bank foreclose. Or find a way to finish what they started. Jackie wanted to finish. She had spent years planning every detail. The mansion was her baby, her vision, her legacy. Walking away felt like admitting failure. She begged David to find a way. David was torn. Rationally, he knew the smart move was to cut their losses. The house was a financial black hole that would consume millions more even if they did finish it. But emotionally, he could not let go. The house was a symbol of everything he had achieved. Giving up on it felt like admitting he had lost. In 2014, David announced that construction at Versailles would resume. He had secured new financing and was committed to completing the mansion. The announcement surprised many people who assumed the project was dead. Work began again, though at a much slower pace than before. David was cautious now, spending carefully, monitoring every dollar. He was not going to make the same mistakes twice. Jackie returned to the construction site, walking through rooms that had been frozen in time for 6 years. She updated her plans, adjusted designs, and ordered new materials. The dream was alive again. But something had changed. The enthusiasm, the optimism, the sense that they were building something magical was gone. Now it felt like an obligation, a task to complete rather than a dream to chase. The children were older now, less impressed by the mansion. Some of them did not even want to live there. They had built their own lives, and Versailles felt like their parents' obsession, not a family home. David's health continued to decline. He pushed himself to keep working, but the years of stress had taken their toll. He knew, though he would not say it aloud, that he might not live to see the mansion finished. Jackie tried to recapture the excitement she had felt in the early years. She posted updates on social media, gave interviews, and insisted that Versailles would be the most beautiful home in America once complete. But her words felt hollow, like she was trying to convince herself as much as anyone else. Progress was slow. Funding was inconsistent. David would approve spending for a few months, then pause construction to conserve cash. Workers came and went. Contractors quit in frustration. The timeline kept stretching further into the future. By 2017, the house was maybe 75% complete. Closer, but still not finished. Still not livable. Still a monument to incompletion. The Siegel's relationship remained strained. They coexisted but did not connect. David spent most of his time at the office. Jackie spent hers at the construction site or shopping. They lived separate lives under the same roof. And then in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic hit. The economy crashed again. Westgate's revenue collapsed as travel stopped. David, now in his mid-80s, found himself fighting yet another existential crisis. Construction at Versailles stopped again. This time, nobody knew if it would ever resume. The dream that had consumed 20 years of their lives remained unfinished, and both David and Jackie were forced to confront the possibility that it might stay that way forever. Versailles was supposed to teach a lesson about success, ambition, and the American dream. Instead, it taught lessons about excess, pride, and the cost of confusing wealth with happiness. The most obvious lesson is about financial risk. The Siegels borrowed heavily to finance a house they did not need, assuming the good times would last forever. When the economy collapsed, they were overextended and vulnerable. It is a basic principle of financial planning. Do not take on debt you cannot afford to repay if things go wrong. But the Siegels, like many wealthy people, believed they were immune to downturns. They had always succeeded before. They assumed they always would. That confidence, that inability to imagine failure, made them reckless. The second lesson is about priorities. David and Jackie spent years focusing on Versailles while their marriage deteriorated, their children struggled, and their health declined. They sacrificed the things that actually matter, relationships, presence, health, in pursuit of a material symbol. They assumed that once the house was finished, everything else would fall into place. The house would make them happy. The house would bring the family together. The house would prove they had made it. But houses do not create happiness. Relationships create happiness. Presence creates happiness. Connection creates happiness. The Siegels lost sight of that truth, and by the time they realized it, the damage was done. The third lesson is about identity. David built his entire sense of self around being successful. When that success was threatened, he had nothing to fall back on. No hobbies, no friendships, no purpose beyond proving his worth through business achievements and material possessions. Jackie built her identity around being wealthy and admired. When the money disappeared and the public mocked her, she did not know who she was anymore. She had never developed a sense of self independent of her role as Mrs. David Siegel. Both of them learned too late that building your identity around external measures of success is dangerous. Markets crash, businesses fail, houses remain unfinished. If your worth is tied to those things, what happens when they disappear? The fourth lesson is about parenting. The Siegel children grew up with every material advantage, but without the emotional foundation they needed. Their parents were too busy chasing dreams to be present. The result was children who struggled with identity, purpose, and in David Jr.'s case, life itself. Wealth does not make you a good parent. Presence makes you a good parent. Attention makes you a good parent. Love that is demonstrated through time and connection, not money and possessions, makes you a good parent. The fifth lesson is about legacy. David wanted Versailles to be his legacy, proof that he had built something extraordinary. Instead, it became a symbol of excess, a cautionary tale told in business schools and sociology classes. Real legacies are not built with marble and gold. They are built with integrity, relationships, and the positive impact you have on other people's lives. The Sigils could have used their wealth to make a real difference, funding scholarships, supporting communities, building something that helped others. Instead, they built a monument to themselves. And finally, the lesson about knowing when to stop. The Sigils should have stopped after the first house. They should have stopped when the financial crisis hit. They should have stopped after David Jr. died, but they did not. They kept pushing, kept building, kept chasing the dream even as it poisoned everything around them. There is wisdom in recognizing when something is not working and walking away. The Sigils never learned that wisdom. They confused persistence with stubbornness, ambition with obsession, and determination with denial. Versailles stands as a monument to all these lessons. Lessons about risk, priorities, identity, parenting, legacy, and knowing when to stop. Lessons the Sigils learned too late if they learned them at all. And the mansion, still unfinished after 20 years, remains the perfect symbol of a dream that grew too large, cost too much, and ultimately meant nothing. As of 2024, Versailles remains unfinished. Construction resumed sporadically over the years, but progress is slow. David Sigil, now in his late 80s, continues to work and promises the house will be completed. Jackie continues to plan, design, and post updates on social media. But the mansion no longer generates the excitement it once did. The public has moved on. New billionaires are building new extravagant homes. Versailles feels like a relic from a different era, a symbol of pre-2008 excess that now seems almost quaint compared to the mega yachts, private islands, and space tourism today's ultra-wealthy pursue. For the Sigil family, Versailles has become something between a burden and a habit. They cannot finish it, but they cannot abandon it. It sits there, half complete, a constant reminder of dreams that outran reality and ambitions that consumed the dreamers. The neighbors have mostly made peace with it. The property is maintained enough that it is not an eyesore. Occasionally, construction equipment appears, and work happens for a few months before stopping again. People drive by, take pictures, and move on. The mansion has become a tourist curiosity. Visitors to Orlando sometimes make the detour to see it in person, snapping photos from the road and speculating about whether it will ever be finished. It is a strange kind of fame, being known for something you never completed. For architecture students and historians, Versailles represents a fascinating case study. It is not a beautiful building in any classical sense. The design is derivative, borrowing heavily from European palaces without understanding what made those buildings meaningful. It is excess without elegance, size without purpose, but it is undeniably ambitious. And there is something almost tragic about a project this large remaining unfinished, like a novel that ends mid-sentence or a symphony that stops before the final movement. For financial analysts and business professors, Versailles is a perfect teaching tool. It illustrates nearly every mistake you can make in personal finance and risk management. Over-leveraging, failing to plan for downturns, confusing net worth with liquidity, letting ego drive financial decisions. David Sigil's near collapse and eventual survival also offers lessons about resilience, restructuring debt, and making hard choices under pressure. He made terrible decisions building Versailles, but he made smart decisions saving Westgate. Both stories are instructive. For sociologists and cultural critics, Versailles symbolizes the American obsession with size, status, and visible success. It represents the belief, deeply embedded in American culture, that more is always better and that material possessions prove your worth. The mansion also highlights the growing inequality in America. While the Sigils spent $100 million on a single house, millions of Americans struggled to afford rent, healthcare, and food. Versailles stands as a monument to that divide, a physical manifestation of a system that allows some people to accumulate absurd wealth while others fight for survival. For the people who worked on Versailles, the mansion represents lost time and unfulfilled promises. Construction workers who spent years building it never saw it completed. Designers who poured creativity into the project saw their work frozen mid-execution. Staff who served the family gave years of their lives to people who barely noticed them. For David and Jackie Sigil, Versailles represents the best and worst of their lives. The best because it symbolizes their ambition, their willingness to dream big and attempt the impossible. The worst because it consumed them, damaged their family, and became a burden they could not escape. They built Versailles to prove they had made it. Instead, it proved that making it, at least in the material sense, does not actually mean anything. You can have all the money in the world and still be unhappy, unfulfilled, and disconnected from the people you love. The mansion stands on Lake Butler unfinished and waiting for money that may never come, waiting for a family that may never move in, waiting for a purpose that was never clearly defined in the first place. It is a monument to nothing, a beautiful, expensive monument to nothing. Imagine a different version of this story, one where David and Jackie Siegel made different choices. In this version, they finish building their first mansion, the 26,000 square foot house in Windermere. It is more than enough space for their family. They fill it with love, connection, and presence instead of chasing bigger symbols. David continues building Westgate, but he manages risk carefully. He saves money. He does not overextend. When the 2008 financial crisis hits, it hurts, but it does not nearly destroy him because he built conservatively and planned for downturns. Jackie uses her intelligence and drive for something meaningful. She goes back to engineering, mentors young women in STEM fields, or starts a foundation helping families struggling with addiction. She builds an identity independent of her husband's wealth. Together, they focus on their children. They are present, engaged, and emotionally available. They teach their kids that wealth is a tool, not a measure of worth. They model healthy relationships, work-life balance, and the importance of giving back. When David Jr. struggles, they notice. They intervene. They get him real help, not just therapy sessions squeezed between business meetings and construction site visits. They prioritize their son's health over everything else. And he survives. Instead of spending $100 million on Versailles, they use that money to build something meaningful. A scholarship fund, a treatment center, affordable housing, something that helps people instead of just impressing them. They travel together not to buy art and furniture for a mansion, but to experience the world. They volunteer. They develop hobbies. They build friendships. They create a life that is rich in ways that have nothing to do with money. When they grow old, they look back on a life well lived. Not because they built the biggest house, but because they built strong relationships, raised healthy children, and made a positive impact on the world. Their legacy is not a monument of marble and gold. It is the lives they touched, the people they helped, and the love they gave freely. This version of the story was possible. Every choice that led the real David and Jackie Siegel down the path to Versailles could have been made differently. They had the resources, the intelligence, and the opportunity to build something truly meaningful. They chose not to. Or more accurately, they never stopped to ask what meaningful actually meant. They assumed success and meaning were the same thing. They assumed wealth and happiness were synonymous. They assumed bigger was always better. They were wrong. The story of Versailles is not really about a house. It is about the American dream and what happens when that dream is pursued without wisdom, balance, or self-awareness. David Siegel believed that success was measured by what you build, how much you accumulate, and how large you can make your footprint. He spent his entire life proving he was worthy by building bigger businesses and buying more things. Versailles was the ultimate expression of that belief. The biggest house, the most expensive monument, the final proof that he had won. But what did he actually win? A business that nearly collapsed, a marriage that became transactional, children who grew up emotionally neglected, a son who died, and a house that remains unfinished 20 years after construction began. Jackie Siegel believed that being wealthy was the same as being happy. She thought that living in a palace, wearing designer clothes, and hosting extravagant parties would make her feel fulfilled. She built her identity around being Mrs. David Siegel, the billionaire's wife, and when that identity was threatened, she had nothing to fall back on. What she learned far too late was that happiness cannot be purchased. It must be built slowly and carefully through relationships, purpose, and presence. All the things she sacrificed in pursuit of Versailles. The mansion itself is a monument to American excess. It represents the belief that more is always better, that size equals success, and that material possessions define your worth. It is everything wrong with a culture that worships wealth and confuses luxury with meaning. But Versailles also represents something deeper. It represents the human need to matter, to be seen, to leave something behind that proves you existed and that your life meant something. David and Jackie built Versailles because they wanted to matter. They wanted to be remembered. They wanted proof that they had lived extraordinary lives. The tragedy is that they already mattered. They mattered to their children who needed parents, not a mansion. They mattered to their staff who needed respect and stability, not a half-finished palace. They mattered to each other before the dream consumed them and turned their marriage into a performance. They had everything they needed to build a meaningful life. They just could not see it because they were too focused on building a monument. Versailles stands unfinished because some dreams are not meant to be completed. Some dreams are too big, too expensive, too hollow at their core to ever become real. The smarter choice is to recognize that early and walk away. But David and Jackie could not walk away. They had invested too much money, time, and identity. Versailles had become part of who they were. Abandoning it would mean admitting they were wrong, and they could not do that. So the mansion sits, waiting for a family that may never live there. Waiting for a purpose that was never clearly defined. Waiting for completion that may never come. And the story of Versailles becomes a cautionary tale. A warning about the danger of chasing dreams without asking why you are chasing them. A reminder that success and fulfillment are not the same thing. A lesson about the difference between building a life and building a monument. Most of us will never build a 90,000 square foot mansion. We will never accumulate billions of dollars or see our lives documented in films and books. But all of us face the same fundamental question the Sigils faced. What are we building our lives around? Is it something real, something meaningful, something that will actually make us happy? Or is it just a bigger version of Versailles, a monument to ego and ambition that will consume us and leave us empty? The Sigils built a mansion. It became a nightmare. Not because the house itself was evil, but because they sacrificed everything that mattered to build something that ultimately did not matter at all. That is the final truth of Versailles. The mansion is beautiful, but beauty without purpose is just decoration. And decoration, no matter how expensive, cannot fill the emptiness at the center of a life built around the wrong things. The house stands. The dream died. And the lesson, for anyone willing to learn it, is written in marble, gold, and unfinished walls. The story of Versailles is a warning, but it is also an invitation to look at your own life and ask the hard questions. What are you building? What are you sacrificing to build it? And will it actually make you happy when you get there? David and Jackie Sigils spent 20 years chasing a dream that became a nightmare. They poured $100 million and countless hours into a mansion they never lived in. They damaged their marriage, neglected their children, and lost a son. And for what? An unfinished house that nobody wants. You have a choice. You can chase size, status, and material success, hoping it will make you feel worthy, or you can build something real, relationships, purpose, presence, the things that actually create happiness and meaning. The choice is yours, but choose carefully, because once you start building your own version of Versailles, it becomes very hard to stop. And by the time you realize the dream has become a nightmare, you may have already sacrificed everything that mattered. If this story made you think, if it challenged you, if it reminded you what actually matters in life, do me a favor. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss the stories that go deeper than surface-level success and explore the real cost of chasing the American dream. Tell me in the comments, what would you do if you had unlimited money? Would you build your own Versailles, or would you choose a different path? Thank you for watching. Thank you for thinking. And remember, the biggest house does not mean the biggest life. Sometimes the smartest thing you can build is just a life worth living. I'll see you in the next story.